In a world filled with constant challenges and uncertainties, it's common to feel overwhelmed by the pressures to perform, whether that's in sport, at work, or in everyday life. It's easier than ever to succumb to the stress, anxiety, and self-doubt. What if I told you that by building mental toughness, you can unlock a reservoir of inner strength that you never knew existed? In this video, we'll explore 9 simple yet powerful ways to cultivate mental toughness. And no, today's lesson won't be about cold showers, intermittent fasting, or running in the snow shirtless. We're putting these gimmicks and fads in the bin. Because there are better things for building mental toughness than the stuff that people do just to flex their egos on social media. Mental toughness, when you really strip it down, is a simple skill that you can develop over time through consistent practice and dedication. So let's get started. So when you think of the word mental toughness, who springs to mind? David Goggins, Ronaldo, some other alpha? What if I were to tell you that true mental toughness comes from your boy William Shakespeare? Well, it's true, because tip number 1 is to Hamlet it. What does that mean? Well, I personally hate Shakespeare, but one line from his play Hamlet embodies everything you need to know about mental toughness. There is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. The point is, stuff happens. And that's all it is, stuff. It only becomes good or bad based on how we interpret it. So one super easy exercise to start building mental toughness is to take a situation that you instinctively thought of as bad and just force yourself to see it in good light. It may be that you were dropped from the starting team in your sport, but that can be a good thing. You can reinterpret this as it's an opportunity to not get complacent and to give you motivation to outwork everyone in training next week. Or you can suffer a bad injury and you can think, this forces me to finally start taking gym work seriously. 99% of things that we think are bad can just as easily be interpreted as good. It's just not our brain's natural tendency to do so. And the more you force yourself to think of those good alternatives, the easier it becomes to keep persevering despite any outcome. And when it comes to outcomes, most of the time people show mental weakness by trying to avoid failure. But the mentally toughest performers actually seek failure. And this is tip number 2. Take the world's best striker in football, Harry Kane. When he was 18, he realized that he was way off the standard of all the top strikers in the world. The gap between them and him was huge because he was so one-footed. So for 3 months, he deliberately only trained with his weaker foot. Every touch when dribbling, every pass, and every shot were taken with his left. And for a while, he'd misplace passes, get tackled easily, and shank hundreds of shots, but he didn't care. He knew that he had to push through repeated daily failure to build up this weakness in his game. And today, he's, in my eyes at least, the best two-footed finisher in the world. That only comes from actively engaging in situations where you've got a much greater chance of failure than success. Those who are mentally tough don't get attached to the outcome because they're so much more process-focused, and that is what enables them to persist despite setbacks. And this persistence can only come when you completely rely on yourself, which ties into tip 3, work out without music. This is one I actually heard David Goggins speak about a few years ago, and I've really taken it on board. He says that if you work out with music, it's cheating because you can't rely on yourself to motivate yourself when the going gets tough. Being able to get through a hard workout with just the sound of your own breath makes so much more seem possible in other areas of your life where you're not just reliant on a playlist as a crutch. Because when you're actually out there for real performance, you don't have that crutch to hold you up. It's just you and your mind. There's no music to pump you up, or there's no podcast to distract you from the pain, discomfort, or even boredom if you're doing an endurance event. And look, you don't have to do this all the time. I personally adopt a 80-20 approach on this. 80% of my runs, I don't listen to anything, and 20% I will listen to music. And why is that? Well, because irrespective of who you are, we all need the support of things and people outside of ourselves from time to time. And that's the basis of the next tip, ask for help. Falsely, a lot of people assume that the mentally toughest people do everything themselves, that asking for help is a sign of weakness. But it shows more of a fragile, weak ego to deny yourself support when you really need it. It's tough to actually pluck up the courage to ask for help. Think of being a student where there was a time that you didn't understand something that was going on in class, but you refused to put your hand up and ask a question about it for fear of looking stupid. But every person among the very elite, whether that's athletes, entrepreneurs, or entertainers, all know that gaining the help and support of others is necessary to build the mental toughness necessary for continued peak performance. They work with coaches and mentors, and if you're looking to become the mentally toughest version of yourself so that you can perform your best more consistently, some new slots have opened up for my one-to-one coaching program, Peak Performer. This is the program where you get me in your corner, and we build you a top 1% mentality. If you're interested, you can apply using the link below. Next up is something a bit cliche, but works wonders for building a sense of mental toughness that you've never experienced before. and that's to do an endurance event. For different people, this means very different things. For some, it's running a full marathon, for others, a 100-mile race, for others, a Ironman triathlon. But it doesn't even have to be physical. A few years ago, I was invited to be a judge for a hackathon, which, if you don't know already, is an event where people come together, are put into teams, and have to create an entire prototype of a software business over 24 or 48 hours. Luckily, I just came at the end of the event to do the judging of the final presentations, but these guys and girls had done 2 all-nighters back-to-back at this venue, taking the odd half-an-hour nap in the corner and not actually leaving the site to go home for the duration of the entire event. And both of these, the typical physical endurance races or work-based endurance events, they have the same effect. They cause you to reach into the depths of yourself that you rarely discover. By default, our brains and bodies do everything they can to conserve energy and make us feel comfortable. But an endurance event combats that and shows you how much more you can actually give. For me, running my first ever marathon last year proved that to me. Running non-stop for over 3 hours was, at least for me, an exercise in mental toughness, because when I was back in school, I would genuinely hide behind a tree during cross-country lessons so that I didn't actually have to run an extra lap of about 7 minutes. But having said this, these events need to be occasional, otherwise you'll burn yourself out or just injure yourself. And that's why mental toughness is also shown in quitting something. Conventional wisdom says you should never quit or give up, but sometimes it's actually more difficult and tough to quit or give up on something because of all the time, energy, and money you've invested into it. This is known as the sunk cost fallacy, and it's something we're all guilty of. For my first marathon attempt last year, I suffered a knee injury 2 weeks before and barely ran during the taper, and I managed to get to the start line for the race, and the first few miles were fine, and then from miles 7 to 10, the pain in my knee set in and very quickly went from a 2 to a 9 out of 10. And I knew at that point I could have gritted my teeth and finished the last 16 miles somehow, even if I was limping or crawling over the line. But I made the really tough decision to drop out, and it was painful to have a DNF next to my name for my first ever marathon. But to me, it was one of the most mentally tough things I've ever done, because I detached from my ego, and although it felt like I'd wasted 4 months of training, I knew I was doing the right thing for my body. Carrying on just for the sake of carrying on is easy, but quitting when it's actually needed is one of the simplest but toughest things you can do. A lot of that comes from being able to wrestle your own thoughts, and something else that helps you do that better and with more confidence is to practice silence. There are so many people I've met who can't sit with silence and just be with their own thoughts. They constantly have to have something on in the background, whether that's TV, music, a podcast, or just filling the room with mindless chatter. But the mentally tough are comfortable with silence. They don't fear the thoughts that race through their head when their mind isn't distracted or stimulated by wider noise. There's a reason solitary confinement is used as a form of punishment in prisons, because most people hate having to sit alone with their own mind, keeping them company. So if you're someone who always has to have something on in the background, or always reach for your phone when you have a spare moment to wait at the bus stop or the doctor's office, practice using those moments just to sit in silence, because you can't be mentally tough without being able to sit with your own thoughts. And generally, just being able to spend time alone is super important if you're to build mental toughness, which is why the next tip is to travel solo. When I was 18, I spent 6 months of my gap year teaching in a school in South Africa. It was the most petrifying thing I'd ever done in my life at that point. Moving to another country, 9,000 miles away from home, and teaching in a school where some of the kids I was teaching were actually the same age as me. I was crying my eyes out the night before I had to leave because I was so scared. But that experience of going somewhere completely new, not knowing a single person there, and taking a position of responsibility forced me to grow up fast. I toughened up a lot in those 6 months. Even if it's a long weekend away, book a flight or a train and go somewhere completely different on your own. It will force you to do so many things that you usually find uncomfortable. A quick note on this one, I'm fully aware it's much easier for me to say this because I'm a man. Concerns of safety definitely make this a lot harder for women. I 100% get that. But there's things such as the Women's Danger Index to help women find places that they can feel safe traveling to on their own. Right, so last up, this is probably the simplest way to improve your mental toughness. Many people might disagree and are entitled to their opinion, but I think to become truly mentally tough, you need to read books. Why? Well, if you look at the data, apparently it's quite hard to read books. 33% of high school graduates in the US never read another book after leaving school. 80% of US families don't buy a single book each year, and 50% of books started are never read to completion. There are so many more easy forms of consumption that we all get sucked into instead. Video games, passive Netflix watching, and hours upon hours of social media scrolling. But to challenge your brain and therefore your mentality every day, the simplest thing you can do is read a book. You're using brain power to create images in your mind when you're reading a novel, or you're connecting the dots between the information you're learning from a non-fiction book and your own life experiences. Sitting in silence to read a book for 1 hour is 100 times more difficult than sitting watching a Netflix episode whilst simultaneously scrolling on your phone for 1 hour. And if you want to start this habit but are unsure of what books to read, then check out this next video here on 5 books that will help you become a peak performer.